A warm welcome to all attendees of this webinar today. Thank you for joining us. And I'm Irlarsi, the lead product consultant of Serverless 360. I have got an interesting guest for today. Todd is passionate about enhancing user experiences using technology. Digital transformation to achieve improved productivity has been his goal. For more than 2 decades now, Todd is accelerating businesses through the automation that he brings in through his expertise into the technology advancements. Today, it's a pleasure for us to have him hosting a webinar decoding the robust Azure architectures with fail-proof monitoring for us. Todd, we are all set to get enabled by you.
Thank you very, very much. Obviously, it's always fun to do webinars, although I do really love actual live events. But something called COVID has kind of put a stop to that for the past 2 years. So at least we can still share knowledge and share our passions with others through live webinars. And that's basically, or pretty much what I'm going to do with you guys today. So first of all, I am the lead cloud architect in Atea Group, and we are hiring. So if any of the things I go through here is interesting and stuff you'd actually like to work more with and do more, then please feel free to ping me. You'll find me on LinkedIn. And if you manage to figure out my email, you can get me up on Teams as well. But we are hiring anyone working with any cloud vendor within the Nordics. So I am going to go through a few, I'd say for many of us, basic steps on how to make sure that you build solutions in the best manner, in the best way to actually make sure that whatever you're doing in the cloud becomes a scalable solution that gives you full control. And by doing that, I'm going to go through a few topics. Some of this might sound like the new stuff, or it might sound like something we've have done for many years, but still getting the overall overview of some of the important steps as we're taking our customers into the cloud, as well as taking over customer that has been in the cloud for a long time. And during this session, I'll try and share some actual live experience that we've had, as well as share some of the important things that we in Atea do when we do cloud customers. In this case, obviously, we're going to have a great focus on Azure, and that is going to be some of the things, but I'll try and elaborate when we see these being things that we can do on all the different clouds as well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is cost control. And this is probably one of those most important things I'd say in the cloud. A couple of years back when Microsoft launched Azure, and it's actually becoming 12 years now, February 1st, 12 years ago, it was all about getting into the cloud to save money. Now we know moving to the cloud is not to save money. Your IaaS is not necessarily going to be cheaper, but you are taking advantage of new technology. Things are more seamless, they are easier to use. And for people coming from the biz type background like me, doing integration in the cloud is way easier. Although the complexity might be bigger because there's more tools, it's still a lot easier. But making sure that you actually have cost control is an important aspect of this. And for a company like Atea, where we're about 10,000 people, we have multiple people using Azure, and we have multiple tools and systems internally that are utilizing Azure as one of the core engines of succeeding in building these solutions. We also need to make sure that when it comes to controlling to finance and all that, it's an easy to adopt feature that actually splits the bill and sends the bill in the right direction. So utilizing billing profiles, like building automation, how much of that can we actually automate? Setting your budgets, doing warnings and reporting. And as I kind of go deeper into this, I'm going to jump into the first favorite part that I have, which is billing profiles. So whether you're a consultancy like us, where you actually have billing profiles split on invoice section, which could be departments, et cetera, this can also be used by ISVs, right? You have a billing account, you set up a billing profile for departments or areas within your organization, and then the invoicing sections could potentially be your customer. So if customer A is spending more money than customer B, you can actually see it based on the usage on the services that you sell. And within these invoice sections, you again bundle down to the actual subscriptions that are within them. So it's a great way of get control of where the specific bill should be placed, or where the expense and the cost is actually being driven in the organization, which also gives you a great overview of doing cost reductions Why are we having all these VMs running? Should we disable some of them? Should we only have them running at a specific time? Why is our sandbox growing and not keeping at a steady growth or at a steady level? And understanding all of these things to actually take action. And this is a place where I often let finance and controllers enter in and look, because it's numbers, it's usage, and they will have some sort of an idea of how this is actually supposed to be set up. So many companies have a cloud economics expert or something like that. In many of the cases, we just end up having our finance department actually manage this place. That also helps them when they are setting out the invoices, how we split them, and how our finance systems are working. And it's important that you actually utilize the full potential of the Azure Cost Management. It does have a lot of valuable elements within it that you can utilize to actually help and have insights in how the actual consumption is growing. So when we talk about cost reduction in the cloud, this is often the place I go in to help them at least have the insights to what they're doing. Based on this, you can also create Power BI reports, get insights from that way, give that to the CEO, the CIO, the CDO, whoever needs it to actually see how the business is running on a day-to-day basis and not reactively as we often do. What was the last bill? What is the bill for a year ago? Rather than looking at how is this forecast going forward. And that brings me into the automating billing and budgets. So creation of rules to split the billing based on tags. So often, as I just mentioned, we might have billing scopes, we might have invoice section, but in some areas, there might be a sandbox, for instance, where multiple people actually have access. And you want to make sure that you actually bill the right cost center, the right person, the right department, based on that. And using tags is a great way of doing it. You can go back into the cost management, you can set up rules. If this tag is supposed to go there, if this tag is supposed to go there. And that way you can even split up a subscription. And also, and this is one of my favorite, is the creation of rules. So notifying of the current cost, upcoming invoices. So there's an invoice coming. So getting the departments ready to actually see if they have had a growth, if they're declining on the consumption. So giving them a heads up so they can take actions before the actual final invoice comes. And that kind of gives a more realistic overview of having control of the cost of your environment. And then setting budgets to max spend. So let's say we have a department, we don't want them to spend more than this because that's within their budget, or the customer not supposed to spend more than this, then let's have a budget on it to keep control of the actual spend that we have on it. So utilize that, and you might not even need the cloud economics within your organization. And when we go into the warnings and reporting, we also have another thing. We have something we call notify the user if there's a spike. Let's say someone's spinning up a service that is just costing a lot of money. It can be a Sentinel solution, it can be a data lake solution, it can be someone spinning up an insanely expensive IaaS and not necessarily disabling it once they're done. So getting notified on the spikes makes it easier for people to take action and actually reduce cost of your environment. Even in our organization, we had one person setting up a solution to show another one before he left the company. Unfortunately, we didn't realize that and see that until 4 months later. Being able to use these sort of notifications, we could have shut that down the day after he left. And not only that, but there's also other parts of automation we can set up and use, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. Then the creation of simple dashboards to keep control. Let the users, let the owners, let people actually see what they're using in the cloud. Because I know as a consultant that it's very often easy to just go spin up the service, test it out, have it running, and then forgetting all about it. But letting them to actually see what they're spending and how their solutions are running gives them a great overview of actually going back in, shutting down the services, and keeping control of their spend in the cloud. And then we'll go into something that Microsoft kind of released, I'd say maybe, I think it was in GA maybe a year ago in December, so not last year, but in 2020, and it's the well-architected framework. It does have a lot of similarities with well-architected review from AWS, but it's also a very important step. So whenever you're building solutions or setting up environments, helping the customer take advantage of the cloud, we want you to go through something called well-architected framework. If you go and Google this well-architected framework Azure, you'll find a nice form you can fill out. Microsoft's done 75% of all the work for you, but I'll go through some of these elements in this slide. So The main core things around a well-architected framework is making sure that we build something that's reliable, that has some sort of cost optimization to it, that helps with the operational excellence and performance efficiency. And maybe most important is the security part. And all of this is bundled together through all the other things that we actually do within the organization when it comes to reference architecture, how we work with partners, how we do documentation, um, which will bring us into later on with document 360 from Kuwai. And then design principles. How do we do this? All this is bundled into the Azure Well Architected Framework to make sure that we build things according to how the organization wants and what the organization needs, as well as how the cloud is built. So going into a few of this, and I'll do some of the points, but reliability. And although it might seem like we know, okay, we're building a reliable solution, robust, should be able to work seamlessly, we tend to forget one or two things. So this is actually a really nice checklist. So what are the actual business requirements? In an agile word, and I see my spelling mistake here, so bear with me on that. But in the actual word or world that we live in, we might not necessarily see how things are progressing. So as we try to work agile, we'll follow waterfall, we'll do Scrum. There's this idea of where we're going is a needed thing when we build cloud solutions. So we are all learned that fail fast is okay, win fast is good. But the more we practice, the more we learn, the fail fast will be less as we try and work smarter. So building based on the actual business requirement is super important. And design for failure. And it doesn't mean that you're designing something to fail, but it's designed if failure occurs, how can we make sure that that doesn't necessarily impact the solution? That can be geo redundancy. That can be having multiple areas where we could distribute potential elements in case of failure in components or parts of the solution. One of the great, I usually use a reference for this, is once you're on Facebook and you update something, you write something on someone's wall, you add a photo, you'll see it upload and you'll see it instantly, but that doesn't mean it's actually uploaded. But for me as the user, it seems like everything went fine. But in the background, it actually works on making sure that that picture or that post is being pushed out to whoever that should be pushed out to. And if it fails, and this has happened, you can try it out yourself, post a photo, turn on airplane mode on your phone, and you'll see it fails. Um, but that is designed for failure. So we try and make the solution and the system work, but a lot of the things that we do is in the background, which also brings us into the application health. Like, how do we actually observe it? How do we drive automation in case something fails? And what about self-healing? So let's say the users suddenly lose connection to the internet and we can't upload the photo. Let's just keep it in a queue. So whenever the user is back online, we'll upload the photo. Um, and Facebook, another great story to do the scale out. Nobody, and I guess nobody would expect Facebook to be such a huge thing. When Mark Zuckerberg first built this for his university, and then boom, it's everywhere. So imagine that whenever you build something, what is it actually going to cover? So if it's a solution for your team internally, maybe the scale up won't be that big. But if you're building something from a startup business, your ideas are to go and take and conquer the world, make sure that you build in a way that you can do scale up. And there's two perks with this. One is your solution will actually work as it expands, but the other thing is it won't be that expensive as you start off. You'll start up with a small need that you have and let it grow with your new customers coming in, letting your business actually grow based on how it's being utilized and how it's being used. Again, designed for failure. So in case this idea that I have doesn't blow up in the market, at least I haven't lost any big money on setting up the infrastructure that I needed. Then security. Many people sometimes neglects this. We think we do all the things that we need, but in some cases we don't necessarily do it, especially with the Europe and GDPR. If I host a customer in my tenant, what happens if one of my employees suddenly travels to India or to Africa for a holiday and starts working there? Suddenly you're potentially breaching the GDPR. So how do you build these type of things? How do you do identity management within your solutions to make sure that if someone hacks your system, how can you protect the identities and elements that you have stored? And how do you protect your infrastructure? How do you build solutions in a way that if you do have a hybrid solution, not necessarily letting the attacker get access to your on-prem environment, as well as your application security? How do you actually build these things to make sure that you keep the security of your application in a way that helps? And there's a lot of best practices when it comes to how to do this in the cloud. And again, going back to the well-architected framework, there's a lot of tips and tricks based on what you're actually going to build to help do this. Even when it comes to encryption, how we do this, encryption at rest, et cetera, how to actually build your solution in a secure way that also aligns with the other elements I mentioned, like scaling out and building robust, reliable solutions. And then, as I mentioned earlier, cost, like capture the cost requirements. One of the things that I know customers, at least that we work with, is being able to estimate what is going to be the actual cost for the solution as we build it. What do we think it will start off with, and how will it grow? And how can we potentially break growth if we don't think we should do that, or if it goes far beyond what we do? And that also means monitoring the cost. How is this going based on our plan? How can we optimize? And one of the things with Azure, which I kind of love, is the vast majority of services. But there's also overlapping services. Take, for instance, Data Factory and Logic Apps. So both of them have their areas of expertise, but they do have overlapping functionality. And in some cases, a Data Factory will be much more expensive than doing the same thing in Azure Functions or Logic App. That doesn't mean it's the right thing to do it in Logic App or Azure Functions, but at least that's a way to look into how we can optimize cost. Maybe some of the complex data transformation within a data factory could be done with an Azure function to reduce cost. And then we got the last one, the trade-off for cost. So as you design the workload, look at the different trade-offs between cost optimization and the aspects of the design, like security, scalability, resilience, and operability. So how can we look at these different areas and see where we could potentially do some cost reductions? And then we have the thing called operational excellence. And in a DevOps world, this might seem a little crazy. You try to avoid anything that has anything to do with operational. There's even companies that says whenever we find a failure, we'll look at it as something that we have to do in development to fix. So we don't have any failures, we have bugs, right? So how can we always make sure that our solution is resilient and work as we want? So the ambassador kind of thing within the framework is a helper service to help, like send network requests on behalf of the customer service or application. Like, how can we make things more easy? Let's say there is a failure. How do we automate the process around that to make sure that we grab it? And the configuration store, like getting all that information from the application and the deployment packages to a centralized location. So not necessarily having it multiple different ways. And then gateways to aggregate multiple individual requests into one single request. So instead of having plenty of ways in hammering your system, getting them funneled in something that actually help offload shared and specialized services. And this is typically things that impacts when we're doing hybrid scenarios. We're connecting to an old legacy application. We're doing these different things. And then maybe one of the more important things that we don't necessarily often do when we're building applications and doing them, endpoint monitoring. So what's the health? What are our endpoints actually doing? How can we see if any of the endpoints that we don't want to be exposed is exposed? And how do we look at this in intervals that helps us improve our solution? And then we have this thing called sidecar, which is basically components that we have deployed in a separate process or a container to kind of give isolation and encapsulation of that specific thing that we easily with DevOps, for instance, can change without actually impacting the entire application that we're building. And then Strangler is the migration of legacy systems by gradually replacing them, right? So we might have this on-prem system that is an old legacy that is running on some old SQL database or old Oracle database or an old applications that is running some um, potential risky .NET version or log4j elements that we just need to get them off and get them up to some more standardized way or better or an improved way. But how do we do that in a gradual way so we don't necessarily take the entire thing? Again, going back to the agile and being more proactive and doing milestones and MVPs. So splitting up a huge applications and then taking advantage of that, just picking piece by piece. And we often do that with dynamics and ERP systems. We don't necessarily take the entire thing from day one, but we take the core elements that are important and we start moving them up and starting to getting the user over to the new platform. Then we have something called performance efficiency. And this is also an important step as we're building solutions. How do we make sure that the performance actually is within the things we want? So auto scaling, background jobs, caching, CDN, and data partitioning. So how do we make sure that we cache the necessary information so we can provide that in a faster way? How can we utilize background jobs to make things even more efficient, getting all the data? Going back to the Facebook and the post that I just did, right? Making sure that those jobs are working in a way that doesn't necessarily impact me as the user. And as I'm using the solution more, I'm going into areas that I typically didn't, so these are not cached. How do we make sure that that solution scales so it still feels like a fast solution for me? Um, and that brings me into the next area that we're going to talk about, and that is enterprise scale landing zones. So this is an architecture, and pretty much that, and we go back to the infrastructure as code. In Azure world, this is kind of new. In AWS, and even for those who have been working with Azure for a long time, this has kind of been the best practice for a very, very long time. Now more and more of this is getting automated. We got predefined policies, we got predefined templates, like are you a large enterprise, a small or a medium, are you doing hybrid, are you native cloud? Getting all of these things set up easier, not only for your production environment, but also for your test and your dev environment. So it's it's a way to kind of build the best practice of an environment, but at the same time making sure that you have control of the stuff you're supposed to manage. And this is an example of uh, the larger enterprises utilizing enterprise scales, and it really looks chaotic. Why are we doing it this way? What is that? And why is these things split? But just to get the core part of it and just explain the basics of this, if you don't already know enterprise scale landing zone, but it's splitting up the things that we potentially see as an operational task, things that we feel the organization needs to manage in a more controlled manner than maybe building the actually applications and solutions we're providing. So having control of the network and the connectivity, full control of the management subscription and how we connect to our on-prem systems, identity, so who controls the identity within the organization. Then we get into the actual place where we build these things, like in our landing zones. So giving them the functionality to still utilize the power of the cloud, still utilize all the services, but they cannot do things that potentially can impact the security, the configuration, the identities that we have stored without getting improvement or going through a process of automation to request a public IP, to request something that potentially can set us at risk when we're building cloud solutions. Even if we have um, elements where we think about security according to Schrems 2 and the new legislations from the US, how can we make sure that when we're doing things in the cloud, that is done in a way where we have more encryption, so it's going to be hard for the US government to pull out data. So all of these things are aspects we consider and think of when we're building the enterprise scale landing zone. And we're going back to the fact that this is built based on code. So infrastructure as code. So if we want to change, we want to do things, we can easily just change the code and have a well-controlled manner of how our architecture is built. So if something breaks, we need to rebuild. If it's a sandbox environment, if it's a test environment, we can easily tear down, build it back up again, and go back to the scratch that we originally had, even though someone breaks something. So that is all the important attentions around this architecture. And it also scales very well. So in Atea, in our main tenant, we had 607 or so subscriptions without necessarily a lot of control. So by doing this architecture, we could actually put all the operational part into free subscriptions and still utilize all the functionality in Azure for our engineers, for our managers, for everyone else that were building any type of solutions through landing zones on management groups, so that we can actually take full advantage of the power of the cloud, but still keep full control of the important aspects that we needed. Um, so I briefly talked about the landing zones, and I'll go a little bit more into it. But it also has things like shared services, where we can access Active Directory, which is owned by the identity. So with policies, we can define and structure and even restrict some of these landing zones for things they can do, like data centers, locations they can put out their stuff, and still keep some sort of control if we want, or we can keep it completely open if we want. And we can decide whether all the key vaults should be in the identity and not necessarily in the landing zone. We can also decide how we do backup and do policies to actually enforce that in the actual landing zone. And that kind of goes back to what I briefly talked about, which is infrastructure as code, or IAC, as many would say. And it's the automatic deployment of these environments. So even within our organization, we have predefined templates based on the actual customer and the size of the customer, so that we can easily deploy an environment which is according to best practice, according to the things you want, in a very, very fast manner. And although the deployment of the script isn't that hard, and the small changes that we might do for a customer specific, the actual time it takes is for the deployment to finish off in Azure. So what we did in the past, building complex platforms, can now be done in minutes. Um, and whether you use Terraform, you want to use Ansible, you want to go through Azure DevOps, you want to build your own Git repositories and not necessarily utilize what is already given to us, then you can go ahead and do that. But it also secures the way you change your architecture. So if you decide on updating some policies, you're now going to allow utilizing a data center in North Japan, you can easily do that through the code, which is also tracked. You can see when you changed it and who changed it and when these changes was done, rather than having all that set and configured through policies in Azure. It also helps simplifying the control of our sandbox and test environments, like I already mentioned. If you want to take a copy of whatever you have in production, you want to have a similar tenant for test and sandboxing, you can easily do that. Just the same code deploying using tokens or something to a similar tenant. Um, and then again, going back to the DevOps mindset, continuous integration and continuous delivery of these type of solutions. And if you want, and you can find all the enterprise scale GitHubs from Microsoft here, and you can go in, you can look at them. There's also awesome documentation on how to utilize this. I know for some it might be new, but keep in mind that Microsoft is actually pushing this really hard. And the reason for that is it helps control your environment. It also aligns with the well-architected framework and CAF, if you already know that. Um, and in Atea, this is the standard way for deploying any Azure environment. That brings me into the next step, which is automation. And I'm a huge fan of automation. Coming from the integration world, obviously I was I was raised in my diapers of doing things around integration and automation. How can we make life easier? So even the landing zones that I just mentioned, automate the creation of them. Let people go in and request and do that automatically. You don't have to have people to actually set up a subscription or even set up um, an IS server. Like, you can automate all of these elements using infrastructure as code. But use the policies to increase security and manageability. For instance, making sure that if the user no longer works here, we remove them from AD, then also make sure that we remove them from the subscription. And you can automate this and take it even further, that if somebody is a contributor or a co-owner, but not the actual owner, and the owner leaves the company, you give them 30-day notice. Do you want to take over? Yes or no? If no, we'll delete it within 30 days. Um, and then keep your subscriptions clean. And I don't mean remove all the stuff you have in them, but make sure that your subscriptions are in a way that follows the actual architecture. Don't let people spin off and do other things. Don't let them just out of um, problems with the policies that you defined, start pushing these things in that way. As well as if someone leaves the company, if someone transfers to another department, they're not going to use Azure anymore, make sure that there's some way of making sure that you clean that up. And the same thing go for Microsoft 365 Teams channels. If it's owned by someone that left the company, if it's owned by someone that's moving roles, if there's too many owners, or if there's so many owners but no activity, then why not just ask them, do you still want it? Can we remove it? And keep these things clean, because they will grow. And the more they grow, the harder it is. And I typically say limitation kills creativity and innovation. And I like Microsoft 365 to be open. I want everyone to be able to run the Teams. I want anyone to be able to get access to a subscription. But that also means I need to clean. I need to make sure that if that person that built it no longer works here, then let's make sure we get rid of it. If that person is not utilizing the team, then let's delete it. and put some automation around these elements as well to make sure that as you grow with Azure, you also keep your cost in control and you keep your environment clean. That brings me back to the notification. So there's plenty of things I'd like to do notifications about, and one of them is abnormalities. So anything that happens in my environment that is not normal. So that can be any spikes in consumption, that can be impossible travels that we see, that could be potential other risks that we not necessarily know. That can be people going in and changing policies inside the portal without using infrastructure as code and now allowing anyone to be global admin without using PIM. Um, and then if there's any inconsistent growth of consume, and that can go both ways. It can actually also go on a drop of growth, like we're actually going down, we're using less than we did. And in some cases that might not be good. Why is that happening? So getting notifications, anything that's not normal to your environment, and keeping control of that so you can see what's actually happening. The same thing with security. So admin roles given outside of PIM. And believe me, that does happen everywhere. Someone doesn't necessarily know, or someone thinks it's painful for utilizing PIM, and they want to have a permanent global admin, which is a potential huge risk. Or they are potential global admins, they use PIM, but the PIM lasts for 12 hours. So when they go take lunch, they forget to log out of their computer or lock their computer, someone can go in and make change and it looks like it was that user. So keeping all of these things in control. And the same thing with security abnormalities. What if someone is suddenly downloading a lot of files? Someone is doing things that is not normal to their normal behavior. And keep in the back of your head that the majority of all these big leaks we see is done by the employees of that company or a company. And Snowden is a great example of that. And that also brings us into the next part with network abnormalities. If something's happening to a network that is not normal, and going back to the things I talked about earlier about endpoint management, right? Is any of these things not necessarily things I was expecting to see in my environment that is now happening? So these things are very important to keep your head on top of. And even as you start looking into these different areas around automation, is also who is supposed to be notified. Because if you get too much information, they're going to end up in a folder in your Outlook that you're not going to read that much. You're not going to care too much about. So how do you make sure people and this information is still relevant? One of my favorite ways around that is using Teams. Like there's a chat message. If I look at the problem as critical, I'll notify someone, not just by an email, but maybe even as an SMS message or as a message on Teams. So utilizing the power we have with all the tools within Azure actually helps us become way more efficient. That also brings us back into the reliability, into the DevOps. If we're trying to get as far off the operational side of things that we can, how can we actually automate all those things so we get notified? There's a bug now, or there's a sudden spike in usage. Why is that? Okay, we're getting DDoSed. Someone's attacking us. And how can we take control of that as of now and try to be more proactive? And that again brings us back to the well-architected framework that Microsoft has provided, and going through that with a well-architected review once you're actually done. So even before you start building these solutions, you've thought about all of this. And like I said, we work in the cloud. It's agile. We try and do fail fast. So you might not have answers to everything starting off, but work with the MVPs. Have a vision of where you're actually going, and then make sure that anything that could potentially happen has some sort of way of getting the notification back to you. Um, and this is where we bring into what I call monitoring and documentation. Um, and one of the key things here is using native technology. Use tools that already are in these cloud vendors. So if it's AWS or GCP or Alibaba or it's Microsoft Azure, then use a lot of the built-in functionality that they actually provide. There's dashboards, there's tool, you got identity score, you got endpoint manager, you got all of these different areas. And if you're like me, you don't necessarily go in and look at all of these areas every single day, every single minute of the day, but you get notified if there's any abnormalities, anything that you should know. So for instance, with the log4j that we all saw as a big pain in the end of last year, it was very easy for us with all the control we had with enterprise scale landing zone that we can actually pinpoint anyone that was using that specific technology, and we could investigate seeing what version they were on, eventually, potentially, not eventually, but potentially upgrading them if needed, or remove them if they were no longer needed. Um, and we all know that specific issue was just a door opener to everything within our organization. So whether that was used in a tool that wasn't that important for us, that could still be an open door to everything internally in our organization. So making sure that we build and use native technology and the well-architected review to ease all of this. And that also brings me into the part which is built for cloud. So use tools that are built for cloud. So Microsoft, AWS, GCP will not have every single tool in a way that gives you instant value. Like I just said with Azure, there's multiple different areas to look at the health of your environment, to look at your identity score, to look at your endpoint management, to look at your health of Microsoft 365. And even if you go more into the PaaS area, you got services, right? Like Service Bus, you got Logic Apps, you got API management, and all of these will have their own sort of dashboards within that solution that you need to monitor. So going back to when you are utilizing a lot of these services, let's say you do have your integration platform in the cloud, then look at tools that are built for managing those specific areas. And for integration in the cloud, Serverless 360 is an awesome tool for it. It's built specifically for these specific services, and it gives you the insight and the additional features that you might need to continue driving the usage and the growth and the success of utilizing those tools. And what often happens with these built for a cloud to support cloud tools is they work very closely with the cloud vendor, with the team that is actually building this. So when new functionality is being shipped out, they are one step ahead of everyone else and they have this already bundled into their product. And that is one of the key things that whenever we're doing these type of projects for customers is we make sure that once we leave, it is built according to best practice. And if they're not going to be a company that are going to log in and understand all the complexity of what we build, let's give them a tool to actually give that overview. And if that is serverless 360, or if it's documentation and document 360, or if it's a solutions to monitor your BizTalk environment like BizTalk 360, then all of these tools are built for that specific case. And there are also tools from other vendors that do kind of the same for those specific elements. So I'm not saying you should utilize all of them. I'm not saying you should take advantage of everything that is within the cloud and go in all these areas, but try and consolidate and split that up into teams so they can continue the innovation and control of these things, which again aligns back to CAF. It aligns back to well-architected framework, and it will give you a really, really good insight into how your environment is actually working. So the importance around all this is making sure that you work with the cloud, utilize what is out there. And I already mentioned it, and I'll mention it again. The documentation from Microsoft is very, very good, but it's also very complex as you start digging into these specific elements. And I know I've been going very high level here, and we could definitely dive deeper. And if there's people that want it, we can do that later on these specific elements. But the intention here is to understand the complexity and then starting from high level, because as we're building cloud solutions, that is the key. Start out, know where you want to go, know what you want to build, and then amend all these important aspects as reliability, as security, as operational excellence, and all the elements around well-architected framework. And your solution will be more resilient going forward. Your solutions will be better going forward. And your customers or your employee will be more happy as you're building tools and solutions that are actually native to cloud and built the way the cloud is intended to be built. So as I said in the beginning, people move to the cloud to cut costs and they realize they didn't. But if you are following these practices, you will see that you are moving from on-prem to the cloud and you are cutting costs, not only in the solution, but in the operational area of the solution, in the management area of the solution, and in the innovation and growth and um, adding additions to that solution. So all of these things together will give you a way more cost-efficient environment and solutions if you do it the right way. So I'm going to go through a few more slides here. Um, so, like I mentioned, Serverless 360 is an awesome product for the iPaaS space within Azure. It's already utilized by multiple customers. I've utilized it a ton of times. It has helped me a lot, and it's typically my go-to stop when it comes to monitoring for any iPaaS within Azure. And I think you can get a requested demo. You can try it out for a few days, see how it actually benefits you. Make sure if you do that you book a little session with Serverless 360 so they can actually show you and help you set it up a little bit. And once you understand it, it's very easy to continue the scaling of it. Um, and then some of the benefits from Serverless 360, and I know they constantly update this tool. So every time I launch it on a new customer, it's always fun to see what's new. But getting the organization of your Azure resources into one place. Like I mentioned earlier, there might be multiple resources that are utilized by this service, but they might be residing in different subscriptions, but you still have them as one applications. So this kind of helps you just get that entire workflow within one area. And it will give you a good observability of everything that's happening, how the transactions are going, where the issue might reside. And again, it reduces the total cost of ownership. Like I already mentioned, this is built for specific areas within Azure, and they help us reduce cost by giving us exactly what we want. Um, and then we got advanced Azure management tool for serious Azure developers. If you haven't looked into this, you definitely should. It's a wonderful tool. And I see here they're even out with a 15-day free trial. So go and try it out. It is utilized by multiple customers. And knowing that even this tool built for Azure is run by Microsoft itself, it kind of says a lot. Um, and even one of my favorite ones, I don't think we have a slide for that, but I'll mention it, is Document 360, which help you with documentation around the cloud, built for the cloud, again, going back to that. Before I take any questions, and I see I've been excited and ran a little fast here, and Norwegians tend to do that, so we do have some time for Q&A in the end. But I also want to mention this event, Integrate 2022. It will be a virtual as well as a live event. So if you can't actually travel, then you can join this remote. I've had the pleasure of being at this event multiple times, even speaking at it. Even on the early days before Integrate 20 or Integrate became a thing, this is definitely the event for anything around Microsoft integration and even integration in general. So you'll meet all the MVPs. Microsoft will be there presenting. You'll meet the people behind Kuvai and all the offerings they have, and you will meet a lot of like-minded people that work within the same thing that you do. And there's a nice way of generating an awesome network. So if you haven't done it already, sign up, get in. If you can't travel, do the remote session. I assume there will still be a lot of good ways of still being able to socialize there. But if you have the pleasure of actually traveling to London and attend it between June 13 to 15, then do so because you will get a lot out of it. Um, and then I'm going to ask for, not for feedback in this time, but I'm going to ask for Q&A. So if there is any questions around this, and if you have any even technical questions, then please feel free to do so. And I think the chat is open. I don't know if they can talk, but at least the chat should be open.
Yes, Todd. Yes. Thanks for the wonderful session, Todd. We thoroughly enjoyed. I didn't even realize how the last 40 minutes have went away. Like, I have a couple of questions. Yes. Ahmad Taha has raised a question. What resources did you mainly use to design your landing zones? And what are the usual reasons for having multiple landing zones?
That's two good questions. I'll start with the first one. What resources we typically do? So typically we do the identity part, which is um, your IAD thing that has any relations to key vault security. We do management, anything that has any relations to areas around management, including our hybrid connectivity, and then the connectivity and network part, which is how we do IPs, how the IP should apprehend to do hybrid connections. We don't necessarily deploy any sort of solutions, any logic apps, anything like that. The automation part that I did mention, we launch based on the actual need of the customer. Um, and when it comes to the different types of architecture that we decided on, they all have the key elements around identity management and connectivity. But in some cases, those are not split into 3 subscriptions. They can be 1 or they can be 2. So the big thing here that really changes on all the customers is the policies that we deploy. So what policies are required and how we do it in Atea, and it's no secret. We have something called Cloud Track, which is our CAF, and we do strategy, which is the first part that we run through with our customers. So we define your strategy for the cloud, make sure that you do that correctly. And then we have the governance. So let's say we go through the governance and we see that you are going to utilize parts of the cloud, but you're not going to do the operational part. You want to outsource that to, for instance, us. Then we'll make sure that we set the policies that help us own that and run that in a controlled manner. If you're a very open organization, you're going to do a lot of the operational part. We might not necessarily enforce a lot of these policies or make notifications on them if that is not needed by you. So the key thing is the connectivity, identity, and management. And the thing that really changes on the different customers is what's gathered in the Cloud Track governance, which is your policies and how you're going to utilize the cloud. And that also defines the size that we're going to put you in. So you might not be an enterprise huge organization, but you can still get the enterprise setup, which is the 3 subscriptions. It really depends on the customer and where they're at. So I think that covered both of the questions. Feel free if you want me to go and explain more.
Yes, Todd. And Nino has some feedback. Very interesting. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nino. Ahmed acknowledges your answer with a thanks, Todd.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So as we wait for a few more questions from the audience, Todd, I have an interesting question that you would be the right person to answer about enterprise scale. Like we observe that the enterprise scale being so disruptive, and how do you think the advancements in the cloud space has constituted to this, or what is your view on the enterprise scale being so disruptive?
I think like enterprise scale is very disrupting to cloud in Azure because
Mm,
it has
mm,
been kind of the standard in AWS and to some extent in GCP. And that's probably because GCP or sorry, AWS has been using the well-architected review for a long time. So Microsoft were seeing that people were building solutions in a very complex way, and their environment as they grew became more and more complex, and people ended up moving. Um, so this is kind of for anyone that's been utilizing Azure for a long time, this is very disruptive because it kind of enforces things to be in different buckets rather than having these things as it was before where you could do anything in your own subscription. So it gives you a massive control of how the cloud growth is becoming in your organization. And even for Atea, when we did this last year, I think the configuration and setting up enterprise scale was done in about 2 weeks, where we decided on the policies, we configured it, we deployed it. But the actual migration from all our 600 and so subscriptions into this architecture were a lot of work. So first of all, we cleaned up a lot. So we went from 607 subscriptions to 100, and I think we ended up with 13. But with these individual developer subscriptions, we ended up with around 100. And we also enforced people to go into the sandbox environment so we can have more control, but at the same time give them functionality to do sandboxing. Um, but for our organization, the biggest change was the reduction of cost. We are saving millions of Norwegian kroners every year by actually having control of our environments. So this is what Microsoft saw when they kind of launched, and this is my guess, I'm not sure though, but this is part of what Microsoft saw as they launched enterprise scale. And that is also why I believe Microsoft is pushing this so hard, because it gives you more control of your environment. It also helps you have control of your cost.
That's awesome. Yeah, Raghavendra has got a question. What is the best way to monitor solutions in Azure and creating visualization dashboard?
Super good question. There is no like straight answer to this that will give you the exact. Like I said, cloud native solutions, and they are built for specific things. Azure has so many different services that what we often see is we take, again, going back to enterprise scale, we take the core, right? We take your identity management and your security or network or connectivity into something that we can actually easily monitor. than anything else that you utilize in your Azure environment. Like let's say you're using API management, Azure Functions, you're using Data Factory, you have Data Lake, and you've moved your SAP environment up in the cloud. These are very, very different things that will require different type of monitoring. Yes, maybe you'll monitor your ES through some tools. There are definitely a bunch of tools for this online, but like an overall thing, there isn't one. So you kind of have two options. Either buy some tool that gives you to some extent what you need, or build some tools, or buy specific tools for specific needs. And the cool thing with Azure, same thing with AWS with Control Tower, you have all these APIs. So for specific things, you can utilize these APIs to help you. But my recommendation is if you don't have that huge organization like we have in Atea, where we can build these tools for our customers, like we do, then the best option is to pick some of these expert tools. And even for us building some of these universal tools, they're still not going to cover in depth on these specific things like Service Bus 360 does. So you kind of end up with the Azure portal itself. You can play around with the dashboards. You can add things in there that you like. You can even create your own ones. Um, but in the end, you're kind of stuck with what you get. So my recommendation is still either build something that's specific for your need, because you're probably not utilizing everything in Azure, um, or buy specific cloud native tools like Serverless 360 or
Mm.
BizTalk 360 if you're utilizing BizTalk, um, or just get it as generic as you can that at least covers the most important aspect for you.
Yes.
And if you do find that one that has everything, let me know. I want it.
Yes. So it's worth giving it a try of Serverless 360 Raghavendra to get the operation friendly view that you are looking for when you are dealing with a number of enterprise integration solutions from Azure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is
Ronit has
definitely my
got,
recommendation. Yeah.
yeah. Thanks, Todd. Thanks. Ronit has a question. For me, notification is getting stopped at the end of month sometime and getting restored automatically. Can you give me an idea what should I check for that?
If your notification, and then this is a broad, it depends what your notifications are.
Yeah.
There's a few built-in notifications in Azure that typically kicks off at different areas or different, like your weekly digest of PIM, right? I
Mm.
like those, but they always end up in my email. And if you're like me, I try and cover cloud and how we do cloud and how we advance with cloud in the entire Atea. So it's hard for me to always be up to date on my emails. But my Teams is on my phone, it's on my computer. So in a lot of these areas, I actually build my own notifications. You can use Power Automate, you can use Logic App, and you can notify yourself based on changes that happens in your environment. So if you find these notifications to be kind of pushed out to the end of the week, or you're not getting enough, you can either go into these specific areas and look for them and see if you can change them, or you can easily set this
Mhm.
up through, like I said, the APIs and notify yourself on the phone. And I do that all the time. So I even automate my calendars. Like if you try and invite me and I'm busy, then you'll get an auto decline from my AI bot, Jesse.
Yes.
So, so I mean, whatever you can do with automation to make life easier and give you the information that you actually need. And I assume most of us are like, if you're deep dive in the issue and we're also relying on our phone, like whatever it beeps, you look at it, right? That's the world we're in now, especially after COVID. We had nothing else to do than look at TikToks, right? So we're kind of in the same area now that if I am deep down in code and writing code and programming, my phone buzzes, I do look at it, right? I don't necessarily look at my email. So that is where I bring all the important messages, not only for me, but also for the other employees within the organization. So make it yours. Do what you need to do to kind of give you the value. And it is very, very easy.
So the next question is from Abhijit Todd. Could you
Yep.
please share some advice on how Azure cloud engineers become architects? What is a good starting point to build a solution foundation, solid
Oh,
foundation?
that is my favorite question. So first of all, I'm not a huge fan of certifications, and the reason for that, and I keep saying this over and over again, it's a nice learning curve if you don't cheat. But there's so many people cheating that it's just getting biased. Um, so you can take the certifications if you want, or you can start looking into. The thing with going from an engineer to an architect is you need to shift your mindset. You're not going to be so deep dive into all these technologies. So me being an architect in our organization, I don't necessarily know everything about network within Azure. Like I know there's something called Express, right? Like I know how it works, but I've never set it up myself. But I've sold it to multiple customers. I've told it to multiple customers, but we have experts that do it. And those are the engineers. So if you want to become an architect, you need to have a knowledge of how the cloud really works and what is in the cloud, and not necessarily exactly how you do all these things, which is the engineer's work. But then again, you will come from an area of engineers, so there will be areas where you have more expertise than others. Like for me, it's Logic App and Service Bus and Azure Functions and all that stuff, which again brings me back to how easy it is to learn all that in AWS or GCP. And the perks with coming from the integration space is you've also connected to SQL databases, you've done data lake, you've done a lot of these services in the cloud. Um, so often when I talk to people that are engineer and they want to move into the architect space, but they're still junior engineers, try moving into the integration space. Try and do more vast majority of integrations, play around with the cloud, go to webinars, talk to people, and understand that as you're moving into the architect area, you also need to shift your mind. You need to look at things differently and not just necessarily one specific problem, but the entire scope of what you're trying to achieve and build. So moving from low level to higher level is kind of like the key here.
That's wonderful. Chris has a question like, have you used Azure workbooks to provide users ability to monitor their environment? Is it
Yeah.
possible
So
to reverse engineer? Yeah, the question
yeah,
still goes on though. Yeah,
yeah.
is it
So yeah,
possible to reverse engineer some of the Azure monitor blades as workbooks? Yeah, that's it.
I haven't done it. I think you can. They're built on top of APIs and they're built on top of things, so you can create your own workbooks and create the dashboards you want. Um, so yeah, it's play around with them and try. Right? There's the limitations. Is kind of like your creativity, because we might not think of it that way, but the cloud is very, very open. Even Azure, GCP, and AWS with all the APIs, you have a vast, like a huge amount of opportunities to make these. My 2 cents though is don't get too deep dive into them and try and make everything there. Like go back. It's one of the things I keep referencing. I love my MVP, so minimum viable product, but also stop reinventing the wheel, right? So if someone's already done it, then do that and use that. But yes, you can potentially reverse engineers and build or add functionality to them if that's your need. But then again, that brings me into one thing that we had a customer request or ask for one of our monitoring solutions for cloud is he wanted to see a list of all his servers, whether they were green or red, right? Were they available or not?
Mm,
And I asked him, isn't the root cause of your problem is you want to know before it fails?
yeah.
So maybe the question is not actually seeing what you think you want to see. Your actual root problem for the cause is you want to make sure it doesn't fail. So we should look at different things. So I think yes and no, play around with it and try it out and build what you want, but don't get biased by all that and keep your mind at the game for what you're actually going to build and not necessarily out of curiosity. Obviously, that's how we learn, but keep it real.
Yeah. Paul has a question. How many people did you have involved in the restructuring in ATIA? And what specific expertise did they have?
So in the restructuring of Azure in Atea, so like I said, we're 10,000 people. It was 607 subscriptions. The project itself had a project manager and 2 technical resources. So that was me and Melvin, another guy in Atea. So we did the entire work of setting up everything, and we started off in really kicking off and deploying the environment in April, and we're done December 31st, same year.
Awesome.
So not a lot of people.
Edimola, yeah. How do you sell your Azure DevOps service to your customers?
So, like we're huge, right? So we do DevOps in many ways and not necessarily just Azure DevOps. The thing I think when it comes to selling solutions, and now you're bringing in the seller in me, right, is it's not necessarily the solution, it's the pain. So what is it the customer actually wants? So like I mentioned, we go back to our cloud track strategy, which is kind of like our first step into understanding the motivations for moving to the cloud. And if that is being more agile, doing DevOps, then we might go through that. And even customers that are already heavily invested in DevOps, we do an assessment on their current DevOps and, setup and team, and see what they're doing efficiently and what they're not necessarily doing efficiently. So I'm not selling them a product. I'm selling them a service, and it's the service they need, which is very individual for that specific company. So I don't necessarily sell a solution. Um, I sell a service, and I think that's how cloud is versus the on-prem environment, where solutions are more common than services in the cloud.
Absolutely. Yeah. Raghavendra has got the final question. What is the best way of deploying APIs into multiple Azure API management?
The best way of doing it into multiple, so you're using some sort of geo redundancy and you're going to deploy multiple APIs into API management in the best way. Um, it's such a wide question that it's going to be multiple different answer. So what is your actual need? Let's say you're in my former employee, we were doing shipping. So we had 90 data centers. And those 90 data centers, 80 of them were floating. So traveling around the world on vessels. So for us, and this is something we just talked about, we never did, but for us, that would have been to deploy these APIs in the respective data centers, and that was closer to wherever that data center was or that ship or vessel was. So the communication and the latency would go down. That is probably one scenario. And let's say your other scenarios, you're running Facebook, and you will have the same need of deploying these in different data centers. So I'd say how to do it, that's fairly easy. You deploy them. I guess that wasn't really the question, but it's how is the use case and the architecture around it and the need and how you resolve them. And I think that is pretty much what is your requirements. Is it latency? Is it geo redundancy? Is it backup, like resilience, making sure that if something fails, so failure-proof development, that will kind of tell you where and how you should do it. And then you obviously set this up in those respective APIs in those specific regions that you want. And keep in mind that might not just be Azure. You might have to utilize AWS or GCP and their API management to actually get the full benefit out of this. Which brings us back to you need to look into your connectivity to make sure these clouds talk together, which is not, it's not science fiction, it's not that hard, but that's also builds on the complexity. So based on your business need, again, services, right? So the more specific we can be and the easier we can explain the actual problem, the easier it is to find the solutions to it. I hope that covered your question, unless you wanted me to explain or show how you deploy something in API management. If so, you can ping me and I can show you.
Yeah, that's so nice of you, Todd. And are you okay to continue with the question start? A
Of
very
course, of
interactive
course.
audience. Yeah.
Yes, I got more questions. Keep them coming.
Yeah. Nitin has got an interesting question. Very informative session, Todd. Thank you. You have mentioned on one of the slides to use native technology. We are using built-in Azure Monitor and it is excellent log analytics database with KQL. Do you think Grafana and similar tools plugged into Azure Monitor could provide similar observability as Serverless 360?
I think, but that will require some more work on your side, right?
Yeah.
So I also said, don't reinvent the wheel. So it's an easy math though. So what does that cost in investment for you to do? Uh, and what is the cost of buying the tool? And then you need to have the X factor up in all of that. So what is the additional cost of managing two solutions? Um, so it really depends on where you want to go. And yes, cloud native, huge fan of it. I'm also a huge fan of cloud native tools built for cloud, like serverless 360. But yes, there are elements where the customer or the company are utilizing tools in a way that could easily do parts of what serverless 360 does. That will be better to just have in that tool. But that keep in mind, as soon as Logic App changes something, they add new functionality, that is a potential way that you have to go back in and change. With serverless 360, you don't really have to worry about that.
Exactly.
So
Along with observability in serverless 360, you also get the operational capabilities that can fit into the real-time needs. That is
yeah.
something I would like to add in here, Nitin. And yeah, Vivek asks, what are things to keep in mind when stashing payload? We have Bistock environment as of now. We are pushing Bistock analytics to App Insight. Does Serverless 360 or Atomic Scope support payload storing as well apart from metadata?
So if Bistock 360 supports it, that I don't know. But I mean, if you're still on Bistock server and you're utilizing cloud, especially for applications insight and using a lot of those cool features we launched in feature packs, say my previous Microsoft days, um,
Mhm.
which always makes me glad when I'm a huge fan of Bistock. Don't work with it anymore though. I don't know if that works for Business 360. I don't even know if you know that, but I think that's probably something if we have his name and email, you guys can come back to and answer if that's supported and how you should do it in Business 360.
Yes, Vivek, to add on to Todd's response, yes, serverless 360 or atomic scope can be an ideal candidate to track this Bistock to cloud payload transfer. Yes, you can achieve an end-to-end visibility on the payload between your Bistock server and the cloud. It's worth giving it a try. Thank you.
Good to have the source here so we get the right answers.
That's awesome. I think we had a great 1 hour plus 5 minutes of session from Todd. And
Awesome.
thanks, Todd, for being so patient and answering all of our questions.
Cove.co